Okay, let's talk about Crohn's and colitis. You hear those two names thrown around together all the time, right? But here's the thing. Even though they're related, they are totally different diseases. So in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what sets them apart. We'll look at everything from where they show up in the body to how doctors actually treat them.
So first things first, we got to understand the family they come from. Think of it like this. There's a big family name, and that's inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD. It's basically the umbrella term for any disorder that causes long-term chronic inflammation in your gut.
And under that big IBD umbrella, we find the two most famous family members, Crohn's disease and, you guessed it, ulcerative colitis.
So they're in the same family, sure, but they act, well, completely differently. They're like two very different siblings. So the big question is, what really makes them different? Let's dive in and unpack that.
All right, if you remember one thing, let it be this. The number one most important difference all comes down to three words: location, location, location. Seriously, where these diseases decide to set up shop in the digestive tract, that pretty much dictates everything else that follows.
Let's use an analogy. Think of Crohn's disease as a world traveler, a real globetrotter. It can pop up literally anywhere along the GI tract, from your mouth all the way to the other end. But ulcerative colitis, it's a total homebody. It sticks to one neighborhood, and one neighborhood only, the large intestine, also known as the colon. That's it.
And it's not just where it is, it's also about how deep the problem goes. Crohn's is like a deep, nasty pothole. The inflammation is what doctors call transmural, which is just a fancy way of saying it punches through all the layers of the bowel wall. Ulcerative colitis, on the other hand, is more like a scrape on the surface of the road. It's superficial, only affecting that very top inner lining. And you know, this difference in depth is a huge deal, because that deeper inflammation in Crohn's can cause way more complicated problems down the line.
And the pattern is totally different too. Crohn's is, well, it's patchy. You'll get a spot of inflammation here, then a patch of perfectly healthy tissue, then another inflamed spot. Doctors have a cool name for this: skip lesions. But ulcerative colitis is the complete opposite. It's continuous. It starts at the bottom, in the rectum, and then spreads upwards in one solid, uninterrupted area of inflammation. No skipping around. Okay, so we've talked about the what and the where, the nuts and bolts of it all. But what does this actually feel like for someone? How do these differences show up in daily life? Let's get into the signs and symptoms.
All right, so one of the biggest clues is the type of diarrhea. With ulcerative colitis, because you've got those surface-level ulcers in the colon, it's really common for it to be bloody. Crohn's, on the other hand, is usually more watery, and the pain, it's often in a different spot. Crohn's frequently hits the very end of the small intestine, which causes pain in the lower right side of your belly. Ulcerative colitis, being in the colon, usually leads to pain on the lower left side.
And this is a really, really important point for Crohn's. Remember how it can be anywhere? Well, it often hangs out in the small intestine, which is basically mission control for absorbing nutrients from your food. So because of that, things like major weight loss and fevers are way more common. It's not just about pain. The disease is literally stopping the body from getting the fuel it needs to run. Okay, so with all these different clues, how do doctors actually figure out which one it is for sure? Well, it's a lot like being a detective. They have to use some pretty cool tools to look inside the body and find those telltale signs that scream Crohn's or colitis.
One of their main tools is the endoscope, a tiny camera. And when they're looking inside someone with Crohn's, they often see something really classic. The mix of those deep, crack-like ulcers next to swollen, bumpy tissue. It creates a look that's famously called a cobblestone pattern, just like an old stone street.
So here are some of the biggest clues the detectives look for. Visually, with that camera, they see cobblestones in Crohn's versus just a really red, raw-looking surface in UC. Then they take a tiny tissue sample and look at it under a microscope. That's called histology. For Crohn's, they'll see that inflammation going through all the layers. For UC, it's just on that top layer. And finally, on things like X-rays, the intense inflammation in Crohn's can cause the intestine to get super narrow, creating something called a string sign. With UC, years of inflammation can actually smooth out all the natural folds of the colon, making it look like a straight, rigid lead pipe. But there is one thing that's like the microscopic smoking gun. If the pathologist looks at that tissue sample and finds these little things called granulomas, they're basically tiny organized balls of angry immune cells, that is a dead giveaway for Crohn's disease. They just don't happen in ulcerative colitis, period. Okay, so now we get what makes them different and how doctors can tell them apart. But what do you do about it? Let's talk about treatment, because how these two are managed is, again, a direct reflection of how different they really are.
Yeah, the game plan for treatment is totally different. When someone with Crohn's is having a bad flare-up, doctors often have to bring out the big guns right away, powerful steroids. For UC, they might start with something a bit milder, a class of drugs called 5-ASAs. And for keeping things quiet long-term, Crohn's often needs stronger medications that actually dial down the whole immune system. While for many people with UC, those milder 5-ASAs are enough to keep things in remission.
And that brings us to maybe the single biggest difference when you look at the long game: surgery. And this is huge. Surgery can actually cure ulcerative colitis, but for Crohn's disease, it can't.
And it all goes back to what we said at the very beginning. Remember how ulcerative colitis is the homebody that only lives in the colon? Well, if you remove the colon, you've evicted the disease for good. It's cured. But with Crohn's, our globetrotter, just because you remove one bad section of the intestine doesn't mean it won't just pack its bags and show up somewhere else later on. So for Crohn's, surgery is all about managing problems like blockages, not about getting rid of the disease for good.
So for now, Crohn's and colitis are two very distinct diseases. But the future could be interesting. We're getting these new, super targeted treatments that go after the specific little pathways that cause the inflammation. And since both diseases share some of those pathways, it makes you wonder, right? As our treatments get smarter, will the lines between how we manage these two very different conditions start to blur? It's a fascinating question, and I guess only time will tell.